Salvador Dalí, the systematization of delirium and the genesis of surrealist modernity. The artistic phenomenon represented by Salvador Dalí transcends mere pictorial execution to establish itself as one of the most complex intellectual architectures of the 20th century. Dalí's trajectory should not be understood simply as a succession of oniric images, but as a deliberate and technical effort to transpose psychoanalytic subjectivity into tangible reality through rigorous methods and an almost scientific discipline. This report analyzes the multiple facets of Dalí, from his ontogenesis in Figueres to the consolidation of his paranoia critical method, his symbiosis with Gala, his incursions into atomic science, and the complex institutional legacy that survives his historical figure. Ontogenesis and the spectrum of the double. The formation of a fragmented identity. The genesis of Salvador Dalí's psyche is inseparably linked to the geography and genealogy of his native Catalonia. Born on May 11, 1904, in Figueres, Dalí was given the same name as his older brother, who had died of meningitis exactly 9 months and 10 days before his birth. This chronological and nominal coincidence imposed on the young artist the perception of being a copy or a substitute, an extension of a familial ghost. In his writings, Dalí described this duality as a perpetual coexistence with an absolute self that no longer existed, a tension that fueled his lifelong obsession with doubles, reflections, and the nature of identity. Dalí's formal education at the San Fernando Academy in Madrid between 1922 and 1926 provided the technical substrate necessary for his future surrealist precision. During this period, he was exposed to avant-garde currents that were beginning to infiltrate the peninsula, such as Cubism and Futurism, movements he explored with such mastery that they aroused both admiration and bewilderment among his contemporaries, given the absence of consolidated Cubist exponents in Madrid at the time. However, his iconoclastic and rebellious nature culminated in 2 expulsions from the Academy. The definitive one occurred in 1926, when he refused to be evaluated by professors whom he considered technically inferior and incapable of judging his talent. An analysis of his early production reveals a prodigious technical mastery, evident in works such as The Basket of Bread, 1926, in which meticulous realism serves as a prelude to the hand-painted dream photography that would define his maturity. The death of his mother in 1921, a victim of cancer, represented another profound formative trauma, generating a sense of abandonment that would echo in his subsequent explorations of the unconscious and in the search for a stabilizing female figure. Chronology of early aesthetic evolution. Between 1916 and 1921, Salvador Dalí went through a phase marked by the influence of Impressionism. During this initial period, his production focused primarily on the study of light and the landscapes of Cadaqués, combining sensitive observation of nature with formal artistic instruction received in Figueres. From 1922 to 1925, during his stay in Madrid, Dalí came into contact with Cubism and Futurism, incorporating into his work the fragmentation of pictorial space and experiments with multiple points of view. This phase was strongly influenced by artists such as Juan Gris and by the Ultra Group, even though these currents were still little disseminated in Spain at the time. Between 1926 and 1928, his painting underwent a decisive transition, combining rigorous technical realism with avant-garde impulses. The trip to Paris and the meeting with Pablo Picasso were fundamental to this moment, in which Dalí began to abandon formal experimentalism in favor of a more symbolic and unsettling iconography. Finally, in 1929, Dalí officially entered orthodox surrealism, being accepted into the group led by André Breton. This milestone coincided with his collaboration with Luis Buñuel in cinema and with the definitive consolidation of an artistic language oriented toward the systematic exploration of the unconscious. The intervention of Gala, from muse dependence to the management of genius. Dalí's meeting with Elena Ivanovna Diakonova, known as Gala, in August 1929 constitutes the most dramatic turning point in his biography. At the time, Gala was married to the poet Paul Éluard and was part of the surrealist intellectual circle in Paris. Their union was not merely romantic, but a functional symbiosis that allowed Dalí to survive his own psychic crises. Before Gala, Dalí suffered from attacks of hysteria and uncontrollable laughter. He himself stated that the secret shared with her cured him of imminent madness. Gala assumed multiple roles in the artist's life: muse, model, emotional stabilizer, and, crucially, career manager. From 1937 onward, she formalized her position as administrator of the Dalí brand's business affairs, taking responsibility for financial management, negotiations with gallery owners, and the daily logistics that allowed the painter to devote himself exclusively to creation. Observers of the time, such as the collector Edward James, noted that Gala organized the domestic environment for Dalí's absolute well-being, researching varnishes, brushes, and antique frames, and demanding from him a rigorous technical discipline. Gala's influence extended to the intellectual promotion of Dalí's work. It was she who used Dalí's notes on the paranoiac critical method to convince André Breton of the artist's originality, consolidating his position within the Surrealist movement. However, Gala's devotion to the companionship of genius came at personal costs, including estrangement from her only daughter, Cécile, and the continued hostility of Dalí's family, especially his father and his sister, Anna Maria. The paranoiac critical method, the epistemology of the irrational. Unlike other surrealists who employed psychic automatism, a technique of passive recording of the unconscious, Dalí developed the paranoiac critical method in the early 1930s. He defined this approach as a spontaneous method of irrational knowledge based on the critical and systematic objectivity of the associations and interpretations of delirious phenomena. The central objective was the creation of multiple images and hidden meanings that would allow the viewer to perceive several interpretations of the same object simultaneously. The mechanics of the method reside in the preservation of analytical distance and evaluative judgment while inhabiting a state of induced delirium. Dalí did not consider himself mad. He famously declared that the only difference between him and a madman was that he was not mad. He used the unconscious as a deliberate instrument, observing liminal states of consciousness and subjecting the results to rigorous analysis. Strategies for inducing the paranoiac critical state. The paranoiac critical method developed by Dalí relied on different mental and perceptual strategies intended to provoke controlled delirious associations. One of these strategies was self-induced paranoia, in which the artist obsessively concentrated on natural or architectural forms until new images emerged from them. This technique can be observed in works such as The Endless Enigma and the apparition of a face and a fruit dish on a beach. Another recurring approach was the use of double vision and mirroring, achieved through mirrors or optical distortions, with the aim of multiplying perceptions and creating what Dalí called phantom images. An emblematic example of this resource is swans reflecting elephants. Dalí also explored visual attention fatigue, deliberately prolonging the observation of landscapes or forms until ocular exhaustion facilitated the superimposition of images. This practice was widely used in experiments with shadows and contours of rocky formations. Finally, the artist resorted to hypnagogic recording, noting or fixing visions that arose in the liminal state between sleep and wakefulness. This procedure was essential to the conception of works such as Dream caused by the flight of a bee around a pomegranate. The impact of this method on the history of art was profound, influencing not only painting, but also poetry, cinema, and fashion design. André Breton hailed the technique as an instrument of primary importance, recognizing its capacity to materialize irrationality with an almost imperial precision. The hermeneutics of Dalínian symbols. Dalí's iconography is not random. It constitutes a system of recurring signs that function as keys to unlocking meanings about time, mortality, and sexual desire, strongly influenced by the theories of Sigmund Freud. The lexicon of subjectivity. Melted clocks. They represent the fluidity and relativity of time, challenging the linear and rigid perception of mechanical chronology. Inspired by the surrealist perception of a camembert cheese melting in the sun, they symbolize how time becomes elastic in the world of dreams. Ants, a symbol of decay, decomposition, and sexual anxiety. This obsession refers to a childhood trauma in which Dalí witnessed ants devouring the remains of a dead animal. Elephants, characterized by impossibly long and thin legs, they represent the paradox between strength and fragility. They frequently carry obelisks, symbols of power and domination, while evoking an ethereal quality of lightness. Drawers, emerging from human bodies, they symbolize the hidden secrets of the psyche and the repressed memories that only psychoanalysis can access. They refer to the concept of the drawer idea, inherited from Freud's writings. Crutches, they represent the support necessary for human weakness, both physical and emotional. They are anchors in real life and symbols of the tradition that sustains established social values. Eggs, they symbolize hope, love, and intrauterine life. The egg is an ideal alchemical form, representing the microcosm in which everything is contained, the initial seed and the final shell. This symbolic vocabulary allows Dalí's paintings to be read as visual poetry, in which the contrast between the rigid, hard, exterior and the vulnerable, soft, interior reflects the individual's own psychological defense against reality. Metamorphosis of Narcissus, an analysis of technical and poetic synthesis. The work Metamorphosis of Narcissus, 1937, is often cited as one of the purest examples of the paranoid critical method. Executed at the height of Dalí's involvement with Freudian theories, the painting is accompanied by a homonymous poem, configuring a multimedia exploration of Ovid's myth. The canvas presents a duplication of forms. On the left, the human figure of Narcissus leaning over his reflection. On the right, a stone hand holding an egg from which the Narcissus flower sprouts. The transition between the two forms is a play of perception and optical illusion. Dalí instructed the viewer to observe the work in a state of distracted fixation, in which prolonged gazing would cause the image of the body to dissolve until it became invisible, revealing the petrified hand as the final reality of the transformation. In this work, the egg serves as a central symbol of potential and rebirth, but also as a tomb for individual identity. The ants crawling over the thumb of the stone hand and the dog devouring flesh in the background introduce elements of destruction and transience, suggesting that beauty, when eternalized through metamorphosis, requires the loss of organic life. Multidisciplinary incursions: cinema, fashion, and design. Dalí did not restrict his genius to the canvas. He sought to invade mass culture through collaborations that expanded the boundaries of surrealism. His vision that art should be pure and instinctive, free from the restrictions of traditional art, led him to historic partnerships with titans of cinema and fashion. Cinema as a mirror of the unconscious. The initial collaboration with Luis Buñuel resulted in Un Chien Annalou, 1929, a 17-minute silent film intended to shock Parisian bourgeois society with images such as a cloud crossing the moon, visually fused with a razor slicing an eye. Later, in Hollywood, Dalí collaborated with Alfred Hitchcock on the film Spellbound, 1945, creating a dream sequence that used the architectural rigor of his painting to visualize the protagonist's psychosis. The Project Destino, a collaboration with Walt Disney initiated in 1946, demonstrates Dalí's interest in animation as a medium for the fluid transformation of forms. Although interrupted by financial difficulties, the film was completed in 2003, preserving the aesthetic of Kronos and his passion for a mortal, set to a Mexican ballad. Fashion and the deconstruction of the body. His collaboration with Elsa Schiaparelli was the most fruitful in the field of fashion, resulting in pieces that fused the surreal with haute couture. In fashion, the collaboration between Salvador Dalí and Elsa Schiaparelli resulted in iconic pieces that transported surrealism into haute couture garments. A notable example is the shoe hat, which materializes functional inversion by transforming a utilitarian object into an adornment, directly inspired by a photograph of Dalí wearing a shoe on his head, taken by Gala. Another milestone of this partnership is the lobster dress, created in 1937, in which Dalí simultaneously explores sexual and alimentary obsessions. Made of white silk, the dress features a red lobster print, a recurring symbol of eroticism in his iconography. The skeleton dress represents a projection of human anatomy onto the exterior of clothing, being padded so as to simulate ribs and spine, as if the body were inverted upon itself. The tier's dress works with the optical illusion of trompe-l'oeil, using a printed fabric that appears torn, revealing a pink lining skin underneath, reinforcing the tension between appearance and reality. In addition to clothing, Dalí designed famous jewelry, such as the Eye of Time, 1949, and the Ruby Lips, 1950, transposing his pictorial motifs into precious materials. His interest in interior design led him to create the Mae West Lip sofa and furniture projects incorporating drawers and crutches. Nuclear mysticism and the aesthetics of the atomic age. The impact of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 permanently altered Dalí's intellectual trajectory. He declared himself the first painter of the atomic age, abandoning the psychopathological focus of early surrealism in favor of a synthesis between quantum physics and Catholic dogma, a phase he called nuclear mysticism. Dalí immersed himself in the works of Einstein, Heisenberg, and Schrödinger, seeing in these scientists modern prophets who revealed the nature of God through the structure of matter. He became fascinated by the discovery that matter is composed of particles that do not touch one another, which led him to develop a technique in which objects and figures in his canvases appear suspended in an atmosphere of levitation, defying gravity and reflecting atomic discontinuity. Major works of nuclear mysticism. Leda Atomica, 1947 to 1949, represents absolute suspension. Nothing in the painting touches. Leda, the swan, the pedestal, and the sea are separated by microscopic spaces, reflecting particle physics. The work was rigorously composed using the golden ratio, phi, drawing inspiration from Leonardo da Vinci's studies of ideal proportions. The Madonna of Port Liget, 1949–1950. Dalí presents Gala as the Virgin Mary in a setting where arches and figures float in atomic balance. The work symbolizes physical and spiritual transformation through the fusion of science with Christian iconography. Crucifixion/Corpus Hypercubus, 1954, replaces the traditional cross with a tesseract, a four-dimensional hypercube. This work demonstrates Dalí's interest in higher-dimensional mathematics and sacred geometry, presenting the divine as the architect of a multidimensional reality. The Sacrament of the Last Supper, 1955. The biblical scene is framed within a transparent dodecahedron, associated with the cosmos in ancient philosophy. Christ is portrayed as a being of golden light and perfect mathematical proportions, evoking an absolute aesthetic ecstasy. This phase marked his return to the Catholic faith and to classicism, using the techniques of the great masters of the Renaissance to interpret the new realities of nuclear science. The American Decade and the Avida Dollars phenomenon. During his stay in the United States, 1940 to 1948, Dalí became a global cultural figure. He understood that art was becoming accessible to the masses and used American media to promote his surrealist message directly to the public, bypassing the artistic elite. His ability to adopt North American cultural language, fusing the Gothic of Edgar Allan Poe with the Protestant tradition of public confession, allowed him to achieve unprecedented commercial success for a foreign artist. However, his ostentatious behavior, calculated eccentricities, such as delivering lectures wearing a diving suit, and his focus on lucrative activities provoked the ire of the Surrealists led by André Breton. Breton coined the derogatory anagram Avida Dollars, Salvador Dalí, to denounce what he saw as a greedy obsession with money and fame. Political tensions, exacerbated by Dalí's refusal to condemn fascism and his apparent fascination with Hitler in the late 1930s, culminated in his definitive expulsion from the Surrealist group in 1939. Despite the schism, Dalí became the most recognized ambassador of Surrealism to the general public, a status that Breton's followers never achieved. Political controversies. Dalí and the Franco regime. Salvador Dalí's relationship with the fascist regime of Francisco Franco is one of the darkest chapters of his biography. While contemporaries such as Picasso lived in exile and produced protest works like Guernica, Dalí chose to return to Spain in 1948, establishing a peaceful and at times apologetic coexistence with the dictatorship. The alliance with Spanish nationalism. Dalí publicly praised Franco as a saint and a savior who purified Spain of destructive forces. He even sent congratulatory telegrams to the dictator for signing death sentences of political prisoners, including in 1975, the year of Franco's death. In return, the regime used Dalí's international fame as a cultural asset to legitimize its external image, and Franco personally encouraged the Teatro Museu Dalí project in Figueres. Critics suggest that Dalí's proximity to the regime may have been motivated by pure pragmatism, ensuring his safety and artistic freedom in Spanish territory, or by a deliberate desire to shock his former leftist allies. Regardless of the underlying motivations, his political stances and his denunciation of friends such as Buñuel to American authorities as communists and atheists left an indelible stain on his ethical legacy. The forgery market and the blank signature scandal. The art market for Salvador Dalí, particularly for prints and lithographs, is considered one of the most complex and contaminated in the world. In the 1970s and 1980s, Dalí signed thousands of blank sheets of paper for publishers, a practice intended to expedite the production of limited editions, but which ultimately sabotaged his own market. The mechanics of fraud. Mass production. It is estimated that Dalí signed between 40,000 and 350,000 blank sheets. Members of his inner circle reported that he signed up to 1,800 sheets per hour, generating immediate revenue but allowing any image to later be printed over his authentic signature. Proliferation of fakes. After 1980, as Dalí's health deteriorated due to Parkinson's disease, the market was flooded with unauthorized photomechanical reproductions and extended editions bearing non-genuine signatures. Economic impact. It is estimated that sales of fake Dalí works in the United States reached between $625 million and $1 billion, with global estimates reaching $3 billion. This scenario led many prestigious auction houses to suspend the sale of Dalí prints for decades. The authentication of Dalí's works today requires analysis on three fronts: stylistic, provenance, and scientific testing, ink chemistry, and paper quality. Institutions such as the Gala Salvador Dalí Foundation are now fundamental in verifying the legitimacy of pieces circulating on the secondary market. The institutional legacy, the foundation and the Dalínian triangle. The Gala Salvador Dalí Foundation, created by the artist himself on December 23, 1983, is the official guardian of his artistic and intellectual legacy. Based in the Galatea Tower in Figueres, the foundation manages the painter's assets, brand rights, and intellectual property, as well as administering the 3 museums that make up the so-called Dalínian Triangle in the Emporta region. Components of the Dalínian Triangle. The so-called Dalínian Triangle, located in the Emporta region, is composed of 3 fundamental spaces for understanding Salvador Dalí's legacy. The first is the Dalí Theatre Museum in Figueres, inaugurated in 1974 on the ruins of the former municipal theatre and entirely conceived by the artist. Considered the largest surrealist monument in the world, the museum houses a vast collection of works and also Dalí's tomb. Another vertex of the triangle is the Salvador Dalí House in Portlagat, formed by former fishermen's huts that were progressively transformed into residence and studio between 1930 and 1982. The site offers an intimate view of the artist's creative daily life, with a labyrinthine and organic architecture that reflects his aesthetic vision. The third component is the Pewball Castle, a medieval fortress restored by Dalí to serve as Gala's exclusive residence. Used by the artist as a refuge between 1982 and 1984, the castle houses ceiling murals and surrealist decorations, and is also Gala's burial site. In addition to these, the Salvador Dalí Museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, houses the largest collection of the artist's works outside Europe, originating from the collection of Reynolds and Eleanor Morse, close friends of Dalí for more than 40 years. The St. Petersburg collection includes 96 oil paintings and more than 2,400 items, covering all phases of his career. Conclusions on the permanence of the Dalínian phenomenon. The exhaustive analysis of Salvador Dalí's life and work reveals an architect of the irrational who, far from being a mere provocateur, devoted his life to systematizing the visions of the unconscious with the rigor of a scientist. His transition from psychoanalytic surrealism to nuclear mysticism demonstrates a unique ability to synthesize the great intellectual advances of his time, from Freud's psychoanalysis to Heisenberg's quantum physics. Although his legacy is haunted by political controversies and crises of authenticity in the print market, Dalí's influence on contemporary art and popular culture remains unshakable. Artists such as Jeff Koons and Damien Hirst cite Dalí as a fundamental inspiration, especially in his ability to blur the lines between high culture and mass consumption. The existence of robust institutions dedicated to preserving his work ensures that the Dalínian universe continues to serve as a springboard for exploring the meaning of existence through art, keeping alive the artist's promise that his heritage would be universal and imperishable. Let's now hear about 10 of the most famous works by this wonderful artist. The Persistence of Memory, 1931. The Persistence of Memory, painted in 1931 by Salvador Dalí, is one of the most iconic images of 20th-century art and a definitive symbol of surrealism. Created during Dalí's early surrealist phase, shortly after his formal integration into André Breton's circle, the painting exemplifies the artist's mastery of the paranoiac critical method and his obsession with time, perception, and the unconscious. The work presents a barren coastal landscape inspired by the cliffs of Portlagat, over which several soft, melting watches drape themselves across rigid surfaces. These distorted clocks challenge the conventional, mechanical understanding of time, presenting it instead as subjective, elastic, and vulnerable to psychological states. Dalí famously claimed that the idea originated from observing a piece of camembert cheese melting in the sun, an anecdote that underscores the surrealist transformation of banal stimuli into metaphysical inquiry. This painting belongs firmly to Dalí's psychoanalytic surrealist period, heavily influenced by the writings of Sigmund Freud, particularly theories concerning dreams and memory. The amorphous central figure, often interpreted as a distorted self-portrait, suggests the dissolution of identity within dream logic. Ants crawling over one of the clocks symbolize decay and anxiety, reinforcing the tension between permanence and disintegration. Technically, The Persistence of Memory demonstrates Dalí's extraordinary precision. Despite its dreamlike content, the work is rendered with photographic clarity, a deliberate strategy Dalí employed to lend credibility and authority to irrational imagery. This juxtaposition of hyperrealism and illogical subject matter became one of his defining artistic signatures. The painting is relatively small in scale, which contrasts with its monumental cultural impact. Since 1934, it has been housed at the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, in New York, where it remains one of the institution's most visited and reproduced works. The persistence of memory solidified Dalí's international reputation and helped cement Surrealism's place in modern art history. More than a visual curiosity, the painting functions as a philosophical meditation on temporality, consciousness, and the fragility of rational systems. Its enduring relevance lies in its ability to visualize an experience of time that feels increasingly familiar in a modern world, fluid, unstable, and deeply psychological. Metamorphosis of Narcissus, 1937. Painted in 1937, Metamorphosis of Narcissus stands as one of the most intellectually rigorous works produced by Salvador Dalí and is widely regarded as the purest visual application of his paranoid critical method. Created during Dalí's mature surrealist phase, the painting reflects his deep engagement with Freudian psychoanalysis and classical mythology. Inspired by Ovid's myth of Narcissus, the composition presents a striking visual duality. On the left, a human figure kneels beside a pool of water, transfixed by his own reflection. On the right, this figure is mirrored and transformed into a petrified hand holding an egg, from which a narcissus flower emerges. The transformation is not narrative but perceptual, relying on the viewer's ability to oscillate between interpretations. Dalí intended this perceptual instability to induce a controlled paranoid state, allowing multiple meanings to coexist simultaneously. The egg, a recurring symbol in his work, represents both birth and entombment, suggesting that narcissistic self-absorption leads not to life, but to psychological fossilization. Ants crawling over the stone hand and a dog gnawing flesh in the background reinforce themes of decay and mortality. The painting is accompanied by a prose poem written by Dalí, reinforcing its status as a multimedia exploration of myth, psychology, and visual perception. This integration of text and image reflects Dalí's ambition to transcend traditional boundaries between artistic disciplines. Technically, the work showcases Dalí's impeccable draftsmanship and compositional control. The barren landscape, sharp shadows, and crystalline clarity anchor the hallucinated imagery in a convincing physical space, a strategy Dalí used to legitimize irrational visions. Metamorphosis of Narcissus was created shortly before Dalí's break with the Surrealist group and during a period of increasing political and ideological tension in Europe. Today, the painting is housed at the Tate Modern, where it is recognized as a cornerstone of Surrealist art. The work remains a profound meditation on identity, self-love, and transformation, demonstrating Dalí's ability to synthesize mythological, psychological, and perceptual inquiry into a single, haunting image. Swans Reflecting Elephants, 1937. Created in 1937, Swans Reflecting Elephants exemplifies Salvador Dalí's mastery of optical illusion and double imagery during his mature surrealist phase. The painting is a textbook demonstration of the paranoid critical method, in which one visual form simultaneously generates multiple interpretations. The composition depicts three swans floating on a calm lake, their reflections in the water transforming into the elongated forms of elephants. The trunks, ears, and massive bodies of the elephants emerge seamlessly from the mirrored shapes of the birds, while the surrounding landscape remains eerily still and hyper-realistic. Dalí uses reflection as both a literal and metaphorical device. Visually, it allows for the coexistence of opposing forms, lightness and mass, elegance and heaviness. Symbolically, it speaks to the instability of perception and the idea that reality is contingent upon the viewer's interpretive framework. Nothing in the painting is fixed. Meaning shifts as the eye moves. This work was painted during a period of intense intellectual productivity for Dalí, when he was refining his theories on perception and paranoia. The barren Catalan landscape recalls his native Portlagat, grounding the hallucinated imagery in personal geography. The elephants, a recurring motif in Dalí's work, often symbolize power and fragility when rendered with impossibly thin legs. Here, they exist only as reflections, suggesting that authority and permanence may be illusions sustained by perspective alone. Swans Reflecting Elephants is currently housed at the Dalí Theatre Museum in Figueres, Spain. Its placement within Dalí's self-designed museum reinforces its role as a manifesto of his perceptual philosophy. The painting remains a compelling demonstration of Dalí's belief that reality is not stable but constructed, and that art's role is to expose the mechanisms of that construction. Dream Caused by the Flight of a Bee Around a Pomegranate a Second Before Awakening, 1944. Painted in 1944, during Dalí's American period, Dream Caused by the Flight of a Bee Around a Pomegranate a Second Before Awakening represents one of the most precise visualizations of the hypnagogic state ever produced in Western art. Created while Dalí was living in the United States, the work reflects his continued engagement with Freudian dream theory, even as surrealism was evolving in new directions. The painting depicts Gala, Dalí's muse and wife, floating nude above a rock suspended in a vast seascape. From a small pomegranate emerges a chain reaction of violent imagery: a fish, two tigers, and a bayonet lunging toward Gala's arm. Above them, an elephant with spindly legs carries an obelisk across the sky. Dalí sought to illustrate Freud's idea that external stimuli, here symbolized by the buzzing bee, can instantaneously generate elaborate dream imagery. The composition freezes a split second before awakening, capturing the logic of dreams with surgical clarity. Technically, the painting demonstrates Dalí's extraordinary control over anatomy, perspective, and light. Despite the implausible scenario, every element is rendered with photographic realism, reinforcing Dalí's conviction that irrational images gain power when painted with academic precision. The floating elephant foreshadows Dalí's later interest in atomic suspension and metaphysical weightlessness, while the bayonet introduces a note of violence and sexual anxiety. Today, the painting is housed at the Thyssen-Bornemisza National Museum in Madrid. It remains one of Dalí's most studied works and a cornerstone of surrealist dream imagery. The painting stands as a masterclass in visual psychology, demonstrating Dalí's unique ability to make the invisible mechanics of the mind visible. The Great Masturbator, 1929. Painted in 1929, The Great Masturbator marks a pivotal moment in Salvador Dalí's career, coinciding with his entry into surrealism and the beginning of his relationship with Gala. This work belongs to Dalí's early surrealist and autobiographical phase, characterized by raw explorations of sexuality, fear, and desire. The central amorphous figure, derived from a rock formation in Cap de Creus, resembles a distorted self-portrait. Surrounding it are symbols of erotic longing and anxiety: a female figure, a grasshopper, an object of Dalí's phobia, ants, and a bleeding lion's head. The painting confronts sexual repression head-on, reflecting Dalí's conflicted emotions surrounding intimacy and desire. Masturbation, rather than being depicted literally, becomes a psychological condition, a space of fantasy, fear, and self-isolation. Freudian symbolism permeates the composition, with insects representing decay and anxiety, while the female figure embodies both attraction and threat. The work is unflinchingly personal, revealing Dalí's willingness to expose his neuroses as artistic material. Technically, the painting demonstrates Dalí's shift away from stylistic experimentation toward a coherent surrealist language grounded in realism. Its precision gives weight to its confessional content. The Great Masturbator is currently housed at the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte Reina Sofía, where it is regarded as one of the most important surrealist works in Spain. The painting remains a stark and unsettling portrait of the psyche, announcing Dalí's arrival as a major surrealist voice unafraid of confronting the most intimate aspects of human experience. Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, Premonition of Civil War, 1936. Painted in 1936, just months before the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, Soft Construction with Boiled Beans is one of the most politically charged works by Salvador Dalí. Created during his mature surrealist phase, the painting stands apart from his more introspective dream imagery by directly engaging with historical catastrophe. The composition depicts a monstrous, self-devouring humanoid figure tearing itself apart in a barren landscape. The body appears both organic and geological, as if sculpted from the land itself. This grotesque form symbolizes Spain consuming itself through internal conflict. Dalí claimed that the painting was prophetic rather than political, insisting that it emerged from subconscious intuition rather than ideological commitment. Nevertheless, the image is one of the most visceral artistic responses to civil war ever produced. The boiled beans scattered at the figure's feet introduce an element of tragic absurdity. Dalí described them as a humble, domestic detail, suggesting that no revolution or conflict occurs without the backdrop of everyday life and sustenance. Technically, the painting is executed with extreme precision, emphasizing flesh-like textures and anatomical distortion. The realism intensifies the horror, making the violence feel unavoidable and intimate. The work is currently housed at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where it is recognized as one of Dalí's most powerful and disturbing works. Soft Construction with Boiled Beans remains a timeless indictment of civil conflict, transcending its historical moment to become a universal image of self-inflicted destruction. The Temptation of Saint Anthony, 1946. Painted in 1946, The Temptation of Saint Anthony was created during Dalí's American period, at a time when he was increasingly interested in religious themes and classical composition. The work was produced for a competition related to a film adaptation of Maupassant's Bel Ami, though Dalí's entry ultimately lost. The painting depicts Saint Anthony kneeling in the desert, warding off a procession of surreal temptations: nude figures, architectural structures, and animals mounted on impossibly thin, elongated legs. These fragile legs symbolize the instability of earthly desire and material temptation. Dalí blends Christian iconography with surrealist distortion, creating a vision in which spiritual struggle is rendered through dream logic. The saint's small scale compared to the towering temptations emphasizes human vulnerability in the face of desire. The work anticipates Dalí's later nuclear mysticism by combining classical anatomy with metaphysical space and mathematical balance. It also demonstrates his increasing technical virtuosity during his years in the United States. The Temptation of Saint Anthony is currently housed at the Musées Royaux des Beaux-Arts de Belgique. The painting stands as a bridge between Surrealism and Dalí's later religious works, marking a transition toward spiritual and metaphysical inquiry. Leda Atomica, 1947 to 1949. Leda Atomica was painted between 1947 and 1949 and represents a foundational work of Dalí's nuclear mysticism phase. Created in the aftermath of World War II and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the painting reflects Dalí's attempt to reconcile science, religion, and classical beauty. The mythological figure Leda, modeled by Gala, floats in space alongside a swan, pedestal, and geometric objects, all suspended without contact. This levitation reflects Dalí's fascination with atomic physics and the discovery that matter is composed of particles separated by voids. The composition is rigorously structured using the golden ratio, inspired by Renaissance masters such as Leonardo da Vinci. Dalí meticulously planned every proportion, merging classical harmony with modern scientific thought. The painting symbolizes divine order, erotic transcendence, and metaphysical suspension. The absence of physical contact suggests a universe governed by invisible forces rather than material solidity. Leda Atomica is currently housed at the Dalí Theatre Museum. The work stands as one of Dalí's most intellectually ambitious paintings, marking his definitive shift away from Freudian surrealism toward metaphysical synthesis. Crucifixion, Corpus Hypercubus, 1954. Painted in 1954, Crucifixion, Corpus Hypercubus, is one of the most radical religious images of the 20th century. Created during Dalí's nuclear mysticism phase, the work replaces the traditional cross with a four-dimensional hypercube, or tesseract. Christ's body is rendered with classical anatomical perfection, floating before the unfolded hypercube. The absence of nails, blood, or suffering emphasizes transcendence rather than pain, presenting Christ as a cosmic figure. Dalí sought to depict the divine as a mathematical and multidimensional reality, merging theology with geometry. The painting reflects his belief that modern science could lead humanity back to spiritual awe. The work is currently housed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It stands as a profound synthesis of faith, mathematics, and modernity. The Sacrament of the Last Supper, 1955. Painted in 1955, the Sacrament of the Last Supper represents the culmination of Dalí's religious and classical ambitions. Created during his nuclear mysticism phase, the painting reimagines the biblical scene within a transparent dodecahedron, symbol of cosmic harmony. Christ is depicted as a luminous, idealized figure, surrounded by apostles rendered with restrained emotion. The composition emphasizes symmetry, proportion, and transcendence rather than narrative drama. Dalí uses Renaissance techniques to express modern metaphysical ideas, presenting faith as an aesthetic and intellectual experience. The painting is housed at the National Gallery of Art. It remains one of Dalí's most serene and controversial works, embodying his belief that beauty, mathematics, and spirituality are inseparable. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos about the lives of great artists and historical figures. And if you'd like to explore Dalí's world even further, check the video description for books, prints, and products inspired by his work.